Hi everyone, it's time for amphibians. Who's excited? This video is I'm excited. This is our Amphibian Basics video. And by the end of this video, you'll be able to explain the evolutionary importance of amphibians, describe what makes an amphibian, outline the classification of amphibians, trace the evolution of amphibians from sarcopterygians to lissamphibians, and describe the 3 extant orders of amphibians and their basic characteristics. So the word amphibian, the first part, amphi means double, bios means life, so double life, meaning that their life cycle typically includes an aquatic stage and a terrestrial stage, and that there's metamorphosis that happens between those. There's several different life cycles when we actually look at specific examples of amphibians, and we'll get into those later. But in general, aquatic terrestrial stages. Amphibians were the first vertebrates on land, and they really paved the way for the evolution of all other terrestrial vertebrates. So that's an important distinction for amphibians. There are about 5,000 amphibian species in the world, and most of them are frogs. There's a range in their sizes. There's that teeny, less than a centimeter frog that we talked about in our very first video, all the way up to giant salamanders that can be greater than 2 meters long. Most amphibians have moist skin. That's so that they can respire through their skin, but that also means that they're susceptible to environmental factors. And so a lot of times they could be the first that are affected by either air pollutants or water pollutants. And so a lot of times we look to amphibians as indicator species. So what makes an amphibian? They generally have smooth, moist, glandular skin because again, many will breathe through their skin. You can see kind of cross-section of frog skin here. Where they'll have different glands. So these are mucus glands to help keep the skin moist, because if there's going to be gas exchange, there needs to be moisture. There can also be in some species poison glands. Some amphibians use toxins on the skin to deter predators. You can also see chromatophores, things that color the animal. So an amphibian skin is a pretty important organ. Most amphibians are tetrapods. I just skipped 2 bullets. We'll go back. Amphibians don't have claws, scales, feathers, or fur. So those things we see in all the other vertebrates, but amphibians have none of them. They breathe through different means. So many have lungs. Many can breathe through their skin. Some breathe with lungs and through their skin, and some retain gills. So generally in amphibians, we see gills in their aquatic juvenile phase, but some, like the axolotl here, retain external gills as adults. And generally we see that in species that stay in water for their full lives. So most amphibians are tetrapods, meaning they walk on 4 legs and have a bony skeleton, but there's a whole order that doesn't have any legs. So again, there's exceptions. As adults, amphibians have a 3-chambered heart and double circulation. So remember when we talked about fish, where there's just the 2-chambered heart and blood circulates just once through the body. Blood just comes back to the heart once in that circulation pattern. Amphibians is where we start seeing the double circulation, where it's like a figure 8, where blood comes back to the heart twice. And we'll get into that more later in our physiology video. Amphibians have hearing and smelling senses. The tympanum is what they use for hearing. So you see that round disc there, that's the tympanum. It's like our eardrum, except it's external, where ours is deeper in our ear. And then they use what's called an olfactory epithelium to smell. And you usually can find nostrils on most amphibians. Amphibians are ectothermic, so like fish, deriving their body temperature from their external environment. And many, not all, have webbed feet, and that's, again, an adaptation to aquatic environments. So amphibian classification, the first 3 levels of classification, this is the same, right? For every single species we'll talk about this whole semester: kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, subphylum Vertebrata. All amphibians are in class Amphibia. That's pretty easy to remember. And there's only one extant subclass called Lysamphibia. And so you look over here, Amphibia, there over time have been 2 subclasses. This one is extinct. So Lysamphibia is the only extant subclass. And then that branches into 3 orders: Anura, Caudata, and Gymnophiona. And anurans are frogs and toads. Caudata is salamanders. Gymnophiona are what's called Sicilians. They're interesting little example. There's this other order that is also now extinct, Temnospondii. They, check them out if you're interested, were giant salamanders. They almost look like alligators, but they're salamanders, and they're extinct now also. So just Lysamphibia, just these 3 orders on Earth today. So how did they get here? Amphibian evolution starts with a Sarcopterygian ancestor. Do you remember when we talked about fish? The Sarcopterygian fish are those that are lobe-finned, lungfish, or coelacanth, so kind of the fossil fish. Some of them still extant, like the coelacanth, but kind of prehistoric fish. They gave rise, as you see here, it was about 100 million years ago, to the 3 current amphibian groups, Anura, Caudata, and Sicilia. And you can see homologous structures when you look at those Sarcopterygian ancestors here, the lobe-finned fish. Their fins started to include bones that resemble the limbs of current amphibians. And so you see where there was that move toward terrestrial living. You can also see, though, that the amphibians more developed with having a rib cage to protect lungs, which the fish didn't have, and the pelvic girdles, and the limb girdles are more developed in the amphibians than in the lobe-finned fish. But those are homologous structures. So the 3 amphibian orders: Caudata, salamanders; Anura, frogs and toads; and Gymnophiona is the Sicilians. So Caudata means bearing a tail. And salamanders are the only amphibians that, in general, have a tail as adults. So frogs and toads, when they're in their juvenile aquatic phase, they have a tail. But as adults, salamanders retain their tail. There's about 400 species of salamanders. In general, they have 4 limbs and a tail. And in salamanders, the 4 limbs are generally the same size. All 4 are pretty much the same size, and that's different from frogs and toads. Some salamanders have mucus and poison glands. That doesn't really differentiate them from Anura. That's some frogs and toads have that too. So in Anura, there's about 4,500 species, so way more. Again, this is where the bulk of amphibians lie. They have 4 limbs, but usually the back limbs are bigger than the front limbs, so they're unequal size. These are widespread across the world, and the males will vocalize in many species. So again, it's not across the board. We'll talk about some exceptions, but in general, males vocalize for different reasons, but a big one being breeding. And we're gonna learn some of those frog and toad calls in class, so that's always fun. And then finally, Gymnophiona, the Sicilians, that means, their name means without legs. And They live underground. They are mostly in the tropics and subtropics. There's only about 150 species, and they might even, well, it's hard to see here, but their eyes are often covered because they live underground. And again, it becomes like a vestigial structure. They don't really need their eyes if they're living underground their whole lives. So kind of a freaky looking specimen there, but they are amphibians. So you need to know that they exist. All right, so go back and make sure you have good notes on each of these points. You can always go back in the video and watch again to make sure you understand each of these bullets. We'll talk more about them in class. I'm going to leave you with the joke. What do frogs do when you give them a piece of paper? Rip it. And if you're interested, oh, here. I wonder if I just moved that for you. I just moved my little picture box so that you could see this. You guys ever made an origami frog? Try it if you're interested. My kids have made them, and you push on the back and they actually hop. So have fun with that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in class.